Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy,
And I'm Brad.
and welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case, and Brad here, and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it.
So before we get started, thank you again, Brad, for last week's episode. That is almost back-to-back episodes from Brad's perspective, which I know you guys thoroughly enjoy. So do I. So, yeah, hopefully if you guys leave enough comments and good feedback, he'll do it more often.
I've got a few cases in mind.
So we'd love to hear that. So I'm very excited to hear what he has in store. So before we get into today's case, here's a fun little queer history fact for you guys. I did one of these a few episodes back just because, I was saying a few weeks ago that during my research, I do come across a lot of really neat and interesting facts related to queer history or the community. But I mean, there's not like enough info for like whole episodes, and it doesn't really fit, our genre of podcasting. So I think, every once in a while, at the start of the episode, we'll have a little neat fun fact of the day for you guys, just to kind of break up the heaviness of what we usually talk about.
Did you say every episode?
Every other episode, anytime I come across one. It's not going to be every episode, but anytime I come across a really neat, like, I never knew that, I will definitely share it with you guys. So
yeah, I like the surprise aspect of it.
And it will definitely be a surprise because I'm ADHD and very sporadic.
That's also why I say every episode.
So for today's queer history fact, I think we all know who the Incredible Hulk is, right? We all know. One of Marvel's most recognizable heroes. But before he was portrayed so greatly by Mark Ruffalo, the next most iconic person to ever play Dr. Bruce Banner was
Lou Ferrigno.
Lou Ferrigno in the 1970s TV show The Incredible Hulk. It went on for like 80 episodes and 5 seasons, so it was really popular. However, there was a slight difference in the TV show versus every other piece of media that has featured The Incredible Hulk. If you recall, his name isn't Bruce Banner in the TV show, it's actually David Banner. Now, the reason for this being that the studio behind the show, PBS, thought the name Bruce sounded, quote, too gay, and made the showrunners change it, much to the dismay and anger of Stan Lee and Lou Ferrigno. So, yes, that is your little fun fact. He's called David Banner because Bruce is too gay of a name, according to some TV execs. So if your name is Bruce, I'm sorry to tell you, PBS thinks your name is gay.
PBS? I don't think that showed on PBS.
Was it not PBS?
That's the public broadcasting system. I think that was another channel.
Hold on, let me Google it. I'm pretty sure, I don't know where I got PBS from then. Let me Google it real quick.
Like PBS is like Sesame Street and all like learning stuff. This was definitely...
Oh, CBS.
CBS sounds correct.
Well, my apologies to PBS. It was CBS that thinks the name Bruce is too gay. So, yeah, sorry, PBS. And shame on you, CBS from the 1970s. So, now that we got your fun little icebreaker out of the way, today's case is going to be a very extremely heavy one. It is a case I'm sure a lot of people deep in the trenches of true crime have probably heard about before, but surprisingly, in my opinion, it doesn't get talked about enough. Several larger true crime podcasts have definitely covered the case before, but for a case that is so shocking, so brutal, and so sensationalized at the time that it occurred, it's weird that it's not as infamous as some of the other similar cases. Today, we're going to be talking about the horrific serial killer known as Randy Kraft aka the scorecard killer, aka the freeway killer, due to his MO of picking up young hitchhikers along the California highway system. So, first off, right off the bat, have you heard of this case before, Brad?
I have not.
So I'm sure, like I said, it's not as well known, shockingly. I'm sure a lot of you who are really deep in true crime have at least heard of Randy Kraft. And like I said, a few very popular podcasts have covered it. Still not as many as you would think, because from 1972 to 1983, Randy Kraft would kidnap, torture, and murder a minimum of 16 young boys and men. However, hauntingly, investigators are pretty firmly confident that his likely victim total is at minimum 51 and at most somewhere in the mid 70s, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. So that's why it's so crazy to me he isn't as well known as, say, Gacy or Dahmer. And it's always so weird to me how certain cases just latch on to the American zeitgeist. Have you ever, like, Bundy is the most infamous serial killer in history, as he's actually where the term serial killer came from. But you would think, like, he is nowhere near as many victims as some other pretty obscure serial killers. So that's always just a fascinating little piece for me. It's like, what makes a case just grab the nation's attention?
He was handsome. He was straight. He went after pretty women.
That's fair. But also at the same time, I'm like, well, Gacy and Dahmer, again, the brutal, horrific crimes, horrible serial killers. But also, there are other just as extreme, if not more extreme. Case in point, Randy Kraft is pretty extreme that just don't get talked about as much. So I'm always just curious, like, what set of circumstances make that case just stick out amongst the hauntingly large number of killers? So buckle up and trigger warning, because this is going to be a very rough case. Randy wasn't the type of killer who just got off on killing people. He got off on assaulting and torturing his victims more than actually killing them. So let's just jump right into it, because we have a lot to talk about. Since this is such a terrible case, let's start with the fact that yes, Randy Kraft was caught for his crimes. So before we tell you the full story, let's start with the day that his crimes would come to light and his reign of terror would come to an end. It's just after 1 a.m. on May 14th, 1983 in Orange County, California, and two sergeants, Sterling and Howard, are sitting in their car just off of Interstate 5, checking for people speeding. This particular stretch of highway is pretty remote and desolate this late at night, and for the most part, it's fairly boring and quiet. That is until the officers spotted a 1975 Toyota Celica. Is that how Celica? I'm not a car guy. Drive past them, and it seemed to be having a hard time staying in between the lines. Of course, seeing this right away. They've seen this before. Drunk driver, tipsy driver. This road was known for him, so they're like, okay, just another average night. So they decided to pull off and casually start following the car a little distance away just to see if he does anything too erratic. Drunk drivers were the most common crime committed this way, and this looked to be no different. After following the car for 5 minutes, it made an illegal lane change, and that's when the sergeants flipped on their lights. The car slowed down, but still didn't pull over, and it would take one of the officers getting on the intercom system and yelling for him to stop before he finally did. Now, as he pulled over onto the side of the highway, the officers noticed that the driver reached into the back seat and grabbed a jacket before tossing it into the front seat and getting out.
I actually do know this case.
You do?
Because I think I know what's in the back seat.
There's something in the car. Now, as the driver stepped out of the car, 38-year-old computer analyst Randy Stephen Kraft began walking towards the patrol car, pouring a half-empty beer onto the road as he did, which is not normally a good thing when you get pulled over by a cop.
It is if that's what you want them to focus on.
That is true, and if that is, that's diabolical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
The officers noted that it was clear Randy had been drinking, although he wasn't fully drunk. And another weird thing he noticed was that Randy's zipper was completely down and unbuttoned. Just looking in his car window showed over a half dozen empty beer cans on the floor, and thinking they were just going to go take him into jail, sleep it off, whatever. We've seen this before. One officer placed Randy under arrest for driving under the influence, while the other went to search his car for anything else that might be in there. Now, as he approached the passenger side door, he noticed that Randy wasn't alone. Slumped back in the seat was a young man who appeared to be either passed out or sleeping. A jacket covered his torso up to his neck, and he didn't respond to the officers attempting to get his attention. Now, the officer noticed beer cans and an empty pill bottle lying at the man's feet, and again assumed that the passenger was also passed out drunk. Reaching in to shake him awake, however, the officer recoiled in horror when he realized the young man was ice cold to the touch. The officer yanked off the jacket covering the young man and discovered even more horrific things beneath. The young man's pants were unbuttoned, with his penis and scrotum fully exposed. His hands were bound tightly with his own shoelaces. Deep bruises were up and down his arms, suggesting he had been tied up previously, and he had a deep purple bruise around his throat, suggesting strangulation with some kind of rope or belt. Now, of course, the officer quickly radioed for an ambulance and backup as Randy sat quietly in the back seat, only ever asking one question. "So, how's my friend doing?" as the body was loaded into the back of the ambulance. Now, even with the discovery that Randy was driving around with a corpse in his car, he was still only initially charged with driving with an open container, as investigators were called in to fully examine his car and the body, not knowing at the time that they were dealing with one of the most horrific serial killers in American history. And can you imagine, just you think it's a normal traffic stop for cops, and you reach in and you find this obviously badly beaten, tortured, dead body. So now that we know how he kind of got caught, let's go back in time and start from the very beginning to give you a whole rundown of this case. And again, we've mentioned this several times in multiple episodes. There is very little information out there about the actual victims. All potentially 51. There are 51 names that are connected with Randy Kraft. He would eventually, spoiler alert, he would eventually only be charged for 16 of them, but he by far had more victims, definitely. And sad to say, most of them, there's not a lot of info out there besides their name and maybe a few details of like how they disappeared or how they were found. Very sad, very tragic. But of course, there are multiple books written about Randy Kraft. And that's one of the sad realities of true crime, just in general, is there does tend to be a more focus on the killer themselves than the victims. So sadly, most of this info is just going to be surrounding Randy's life, his movements to connect him to the murders, and maybe how he grew up to be so sadistic. We'll find out. So he was born on March 19th, 1945 in Long Beach, California, and was the fourth child and only son of Harold and Opal Kraft. The family had moved out to California from Wyoming at the outbreak of America's entry into World War II, and since then, Harold had found success working as a production tech at an aircraft facility. Everyone in Randy's family stated that he was spoiled rotten by all of them. His parents doted on their baby boy, and his three older sisters loved to act motherly towards him as well, and by all accounts, his childhood was ideal. The only noticeable incident was when Randy was 3. He was described as, quote, rambunctious, and often got into things, which caused an accident where he actually fell off a porch and landed directly on his head on the concrete below. It was so serious he was actually knocked unconscious for several hours. And again, for those of you deep in the trenches of true crime, you'll know that there are so many serial killers who were described as having completely normal childhoods, except for an incident or two when they suffered serious head injury or concussion. And so bad, I'm pretty sure they have established like there is a correlation between head trauma and violent tendencies later in life. Definitely want to find a full study on that because it is fascinating. Because other than this, there's really nothing to suggest that Randy had any outward causes to what he would eventually do. Not long after, the family moved from Long Beach to Orange County, with Randy's mother and 3 sisters becoming very involved with the local church. Throughout his childhood, Randy was described as being highly happy and very intelligent, So intelligent, in fact, that when he entered the 6th grade, his teachers recommended that he skip several grades. Randy was also said to be well liked by his classmates and fairly popular, especially with his female classmates who described him as a quote, little gentleman. It was also during this time that Randy became a very staunch Republican and began telling his family that his dream was to grow up and become a U.S. Senator. He eventually started a World's Affair Club with 2 of his close friends in high school, and by the time he got to his senior year, Randy was described as being one of the most popular kids at Westminster High School. Although several teachers stated his only issue was he seemed to feel like the rules didn't apply to him due to his high level of intelligence. And I think I read somewhere, I didn't put it in my notes, but he had like an IQ of like 127 to 130, which I don't know how to read IQs, but is
It's pretty smart.
pretty smart. Now, Randy would later state that he knew he was gay from a very early age, but never knew how to properly express or process these feelings. After graduating from high school in 1963, he enrolled in Claremont College, where he often took part in campus politics and events such as advocating for U.S. troops to invade Vietnam. But not long after going off to college, Randy began to feel his beliefs change as he was now at an all-boys school, and those feelings of homosexuality started to bubble up again. In the summer of 1964, he had his first gay relationship with a man he only called Mike, an African-American man from town. The two spent several months together, and it was during this time that Randy began to move away from conservative politics and announced that he was actually an atheist. Stating he never really believed most of what he was saying, he was just parroting his parents, which is common even to this day. He also started to fully embrace his homosexual tendencies and started to indulge himself by often going to local cruising spots, including Laguna and Huntington Beach. He often snuck out of his dorm room late at night and wouldn't return until the early morning hours, which did cause a few of his classmates to kind of look at him weird. And although a few began to suspect that he was meeting up with men, most just brushed it off, as Randy was still maintaining his cool and popular demeanor around people. Now, Randy would eventually learn of the underground queer scene in Southern California and learned where all the popular gay bars and areas were around town and the spots where police usually turned a blind eye. He began to venture out to the bars, picking up and hooking up with various men. He eventually even got a part-time job as a bartender at one of the gay bars. And over the next year or so, Randy met and had relationships with several men, all of whom he would bring home to meet his family. And he would later say that this was his subtle way to nudge them, to let them know that, hey, I'm a homosexual. But his family would later state, until he told them outright, they had no idea. Which also very common. Like, you think they gotta know.
I like your little friend. He was really nice.
I also love that they're always like, is your little friend coming? Is your roommate coming?
Your buddy.
And you would think they're like, they know, that's their way of being polite. But then sometimes they're like, no, I had no idea. And it's like, really? Now, Randy only got in trouble with the law one time up to this point, and that was in 1966 when he was arrested for, quote, lewd behavior, after attempting to sexually proposition an undercover cop at a cruising spot in Huntington Beach. Now, although he was arrested, due to having no prior criminal record, this was kept off his record and he was let go. By his senior year of college, Randy had seemed to give up on schooling as he preferred to spend his time drinking, having sex, and partying all night. This led to him actually failing his senior year and having to retake a bunch of classes just to graduate 8 months later in February of 1968. Now, after graduating from college, Randy decided to enlist in the Air Force and was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California, where he quickly rose to the rank of Airman First Class and became a supervisor. Now, as 1968 turned to 1969, the world saw a huge shift in how gay men and queer people were seen by the general public. A little known thing happened in 1969. I don't know if you guys know about it. A little event called the
Stonewall.
The Stonewall Uprising. Queer people were now at the forefront of TV, protests, and magazines, and this caused a domino effect that inspired thousands of closeted queer people around the world to come out, including Randy, who told his entire family that he was gay in a letter to them in 1969, which for back then is very ballsy
Progressive.
and very progressive. Now, although his parents did not initially take the news very well, it actually didn't take them long before his whole family accepted him and continued to love and support him. So, best case scenario, especially in the 60s, although his sisters would later state that he did become distant from them after coming out. Now, during his time in the Air Force, Randy excelled at all of it, but would later write letters to friends stating he hated how isolating the airbase was from civilization and he missed socializing and meeting new guys. This eventually led to him announcing to his superiors that he was gay on July 26, 1969, and they granted him a general discharge due to, quote, medical reasons, after just 13 months of service. Following this, he moved back in with his parents, got another job as a bartender at a gay bar outside of town, and so up until this point, Randy has lived a pretty decent life. Yeah, he's had some bumps along the way, but he's not doing anything or really showed any signs of being capable of doing anything violent. And so I wish I could tell you the story ended here. It's just the story of a very intelligent young man who's just trying to find his place in the world as a gay man. But sadly, that is not the case. Randy Kraft would remain out of trouble for several months after his discharge from the Army, but that would all change in March of 1970 when he would commit his first sexual assault. So, trigger warning. One evening when Randy was at Huntington Beach cruising for men to have sex with, he would spot a young boy, 13-year-old Joseph Fanker, riding his bike along a path. Randy approached the boy to offer him a cigarette and learned that Joseph was a runaway and homeless. Randy asked if he wanted to come stay at his apartment for a few days, and he agreed. Once back at Randy's apartment, Randy offered the young boy several pills and joints, which Joseph happily accepted. But not long after this, he would feel himself grow lightheaded and eventually paralyzed, but still fully conscious. Over the next 8 hours, Randy would beat and sexually assault Joseph while he laid on the bed, unable to move or speak. Randy threatened to murder him several times if he did anything to try to escape, and eventually told Joseph that he had to go to work, and so that's the only time the assault stopped, and he left Joseph alone, still paralyzed in his apartment. After several more hours of being paralyzed, Joseph was able to gain enough movement in his body to drag himself out of the apartment and into the street, where he was able to be picked up by a passing motorist. Now, of course, police were quickly called, and Joseph was taken to the hospital where he had to have his stomach pumped, and doctors would later state that he was only 1 or 2 pills away from dying of an overdose. Now, although Joseph told police Randy drugged and beat him, he left out the sexual assaults as he was ashamed of what people may think. Due to this, and the fact that Joseph admitted that he took the pills Randy gave him willingly, they refused to press charges, and Randy was free to go. Again, that shows you the double standard of how police dealt with gay crimes. And we'll see this quite a few with Randy's murders, is they weren't really investigated because they were chalked up as, oh, it was a gay lover's quarrel. The gays are murdering each other in jealous rages. What are you going to do? That's, just let them do what they want. And also, this is a
13-year-old boy?
This is a 13-year-old boy. Even if he left out the sexual assault part, the beating and drugging, a grown man beating and drugging a literal teenage boy, and they're just like, well, you took the pills he gave you willingly, so that's your own fault. We're not pressing charges. And the thing that makes it even more infuriating is if they had actually took the time to investigate and press charges, they potentially could have stopped one of the most prolific serial killers in history before he even started and saved the lives of possibly 70 plus men and young boys. So at this point, we are going to start getting into the many murders committed by Randy Kraft. Now, many questions still remain about exactly why Randy began murdering the boys when he did. There was never able to firmly establish, what was the tipping point?
What was the triggering point?
Yeah, because you went from drugging and assaulting, only one note. Of course, he had to have done it more.
Well, to be fair, he literally just decided to pick up a boy and drug and assault him on a dime. So it's not a far skip and a jump to doing something a lot worse. Not for somebody like that. I mean, he didn't like molest anybody
Mm-mm.
that we know of or anything, which is awful, but it's usually like things tend to escalate. He jumped a whole lot of steps and went straight to kidnapping, and if he hadn't escaped on his own, probably murder at that point.
And that's the thing, a lot of people, especially with serial killers this brutal, everyone always goes back and like, what were the warning signs? Like, how could we have prevented this? And that's the thing, before the assault, by all accounts, Randy gave no indication of being short-tempered, angry, trouble with the law, like any of the common warning signs usually of, violent tendencies. He never really showed. And so that's why people are still like, and of course, maybe there is no answer. Maybe it is one day he just decided. But people will always wonder, like, what made you finally just start murdering all these people in such a rapid succession?
Everybody always wants to understand why, and sometimes I think there's no reason for it. There's no valid reason, of course, but I mean, in their messed up way,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're like, oh, I just had these voices in my head, or I just had these urges. And then sometimes they're just like, that person was just there at the wrong time.
And I think that's the most terrifying thing for me is sometimes there's not a reason. Sometimes there are just bad people that want to do bad things.
That's the scariest ones to me.
So what we do know, and also we don't know a lot of the details of like how he operated and stuff because Randy Kraft never made a full confession. But what we can do is piece together what we know from his trial and testimony and stuff like that. So we know that the first confirmed victim of the man who would become known as the scorecard killer was discovered on October 5th, 1971. That evening, the badly decomposed body of a nude man was found at the bottom of a ravine off Ortega Highway. No official cause of death could be determined due to decomp, but a coroner discovered that the man's blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit and listed his official cause of death as alcohol poisoning. They also determined that the body had been out there since at least September 20th. Police were able to quickly identify the man as being 30-year-old Wayne Joseph Ducat, a local gay man who lived in Long Beach. Now, although he hadn't been reported missing, Wayne had not been seen or heard from for over 2 weeks. Investigators also found his car abandoned in the parking lot of a beachside gay bar called The Stable, which is where he often bartended on the weekends. There were no witnesses to what happened to Wayne after the 20th, when he was last seen, and police chalked his death up to being a tragic accident, with whoever he was partying with possibly panicking and dumping his body into the ravine. So they're saying we don't think he was murdered, and yeah, someone had to have stripped him nude and tossed his body off the interstate into a ravine. But I mean, that's no concern. Yeah. Moving on.
The alcohol would have got him anyway.
Yeah, essentially how they're acting so blasé about this. Now, his case was closed right after that, and he was buried on October 8th. When Randy's car would later be raided following his arrest, investigators found a scorecard. This is how they've determined most of his victims. Again, Randy never made a confession. To this day, spoiler alert, he's also still alive. I didn't realize that until researching this case. He's never confessed to any murder. He maintains his innocence. The only way police know his victims are the ones they've been able to piece together with DNA, MO, and a sheet of paper that was a scorecard sheet like they have in sports back in the day. And he used this to keep track of his victims, giving dates when they were murdered, sometimes giving their names, sometimes giving just words to describe them or to describe a location where he picked them up. And that's where they found over 70 plus names written on it. But the first entry was dated the 20th of September, simply stating stable, which investigators took to be in reference to Wayne working at the stable bar and most likely where Randy picked him up. Now, following his first murder, Randy would not kill again for almost 15 months. During this time, he re-enrolled in college at Long Beach State University to study education and got into a serious relationship with a man named Jeff Graves, as the two even moved in together. The couple became a staple in the local queer scene and even went on several vacations during this time to Europe and Mexico, and things seemed to be going great. And that, again, for almost over a year, he only murdered one person and then he just continued with life as normal. So a lot of people would love to have him sit down and explain his rationale and his way of thinking, because he's like, life's good now. I murdered someone,
Had to get that out of my system, I guess.
and then for 15 months, I'm good. Now, over the course of 1972, the two's relationship had its fair share of trouble as Jeff suffered from significant substance abuse issues, and Randy was finding himself wanting to open his and Jeff's relationship up to include more sexual partners, something Jeff was initially uncomfortable with. Now, at first, the two would go out to the bars and cruising areas together to look for men to take home for threesomes, but after a while, Jeff didn't want to do this anymore, and instead just allowed Randy to go off by himself to hook up with guys, as long as he promised to return home once he was done, and this seemed to work. This was a compromise. But it wasn't long after Jeff began to allow Randy to go off on his own to cruise for guys that he would claim his second victim. On December 26, 1972, at just after 1 a.m., a motorist traveling along the 405 freeway in Seal Beach spotted the body of a man lying just off the side of the road. The man's pants were partially pulled down, and he wore no shirt, only a jacket. He had no shoes and was only wearing one sock. The other sock would be found rammed inside of his rectum during a later autopsy. The body was quickly identified as being 20-year-old U.S. Marine Edward Daniel Moore, who disappeared after leaving his barracks at Camp Pendleton 2 days before on the 24th. Now, unlike Wayne, it was very clear that Edward's death was a brutal homicide. An autopsy would reveal that he had deep bruises on his wrists and ankles, suggesting he had been bound. He had been brutally beaten across the face with a metal pipe, leaving him almost unrecognizable, but his eventual cause of death would be strangulation, as a garrote had been wrapped tightly around his throat. Edward's body also bore signs of sexual torture, as his penis had a deep bite mark that almost went all the way through, and his scrotum had partially been torn open by what police believed to be the killer's fingernails. Scrapes and bruises on his body also suggested that he had been pushed from a moving vehicle. Now, besides the horrific state of his body, there was no evidence or clues as to who did this to Edward, nor was any motive able to be established. Almost immediately, suspicion actually fell on several of Edward's fellow Marines at Camp Pendleton, all of whom were brought in and interrogated and accused of murdering Edward. All of them denied having any involvement, and without any evidence, they were all let go, thankfully. Several suggested that it was possible Edward had met and befriended someone at one of the local bars who murdered him. He was known to go out to the various bars and was described as a social butterfly who talked to everyone. But despite this clue and several weeks of investigating, no leads would ever be uncovered as to who murdered Edward, and his case would quickly go cold. During this time, Randy and Jeff's relationship continued to sour as the two were growing distant, and this resulted often in the two arguing, with Randy storming out and going on, quote, drives for most of the night to clear his head. And it would be during this time that most of the bodies began to pile up around the area. Despite Randy beginning to ramp up his brutal murders, Jeff would later state that he never once suspected any sort of violent tendencies from Randy, nor was Randy ever violent or abusive towards him. Now, we will touch more on that later because, as we will see later on, police are also pretty confident that Randy had to have had help in at least several of these murders. Not saying it was Jeff, but he is put forth as a potential candidate. Now, following the murder of Edward Moore, Randy Kraft would begin to ramp up his murder spree as more and more bodies of young men began to be found all along the California highway system. 6 weeks after Edward's murder on February 6, 1973 at 11:30 a.m., the nude body of a John Doe was found lying in a ditch along the Terminal Island Freeway in Los Angeles. The only piece of clothing he had was a single brown sock, which had been rammed into his rectum. He had a deep bruise around his throat, and investigators concluded that he had been murdered by being garroted with piano wire. Now, although his photo was distributed around the area, no one came forward to identify the victim. Although several people stated that they saw him hustling on a beach not far from where his body was found, he is estimated to be between 18 and 20 years old and had been dead for less than 48 hours before his body was found. Again, not much was known or found in the way of evidence, and his case quickly went cold. Now, although we now know he was a victim of Randy Kraft, his identity has still never been discovered, and he remains a John Doe to this day. And those cases always bother me too. Like, you'll find these victims like John Doe, and like, it's always so bothersome because they have a name. They have a family, they have friends, and it's the fact that they're essentially a ghost is just so heartbreaking and tragic. So 2 months after the John Doe was found, on April 14th, 1973, at 1:30 in the morning, the fully clothed body of a teenage boy was discovered lying off the side of the road near Huntington Beach. Although he had all his clothes on him, it appeared his murder was very violent. A large red stain was over the center of his crotch, and when a later autopsy would remove his clothes, it was discovered that he had actually been castrated, sodomized, and then his severed penis inserted into his rectum. It would be confirmed that this was done while he was still alive, as his official cause of death would be strangulation with a ligature.
That's horrible.
Horrific. And
That also shows that he is escalating quickly.
very quickly. And sad to say, that is not even the worst thing he does. The victim would be identified as 17-year-old Kevin Clark Bailey, a runaway who had last been seen hanging around a traveling carnival several days before his body was found. And again, 17 years old. Now, a week later, he's also ramping up how frequent he's killing people. On April 22nd, the dismembered remains of a John Doe were found scattered all along the interstate in Wilmington. His arms, legs, hands, torso, and head were all hacked off with a saw, and it took investigators 2 weeks just to fully assemble it back together, although his hands were never found. Now, even though multiple victims had been found by this point, a serial killer was still not suspected or even on police's radar, and each case was believed to be isolated incidents of violence between, quote, and this is a quote from an investigator, gay lover quarrel gone wrong.
We've heard that a few times before.
We have heard that a few times before.
Somebody gets hacked to pieces, and that's a gay lover's quarrel gone wrong.
And again, not assuming anything by stating during this time, police didn't care about crimes committed against openly gay queer people. 9 times out of the 10, they were like, yeah, it was just, we know what the motive is. He got in a fight with his boyfriend got jealous, killed him, dumped him. I mean, we don't have to worry because, it was an isolated incident of violence. He just wanted to kill his boyfriend. He's probably not going to kill again. Case closed, boys. Let's pack it up and go home.
Or a lot of times they're like, they're only killing gay people. It's not like anybody misses them or anything like that.
And again, that too, very sad. And honestly, happens a lot less, but it still happens today. But even with this gay lover's quarrel gone wrong, it would be the next victim found that would eventually convince investigators that they had a serial killer on their hands and that all the cases may be related. At 6 in the morning on July 30th, the fully clothed body of a young man would be found lying off the side of the road along the off-ramp of the 405 freeway. The victim was identified as 20-year-old Ronnie Gene Weeb, and he was found to have been murdered by ligature strangulation. He had a sock inserted into his rectum, and his penis was found exposed and having a deep bite mark in it. He bore signs of being beaten, and investigators believe that he was hung upside down from rafters due to bruising on his wrists and ankles. Now, Ronnie was also last seen 2 days prior, as he was seen leaving a sports bar right after closing. His car was found still parked at the bar, although it had a flat tire. Unlike the previous victims, however, Ronnie was married to a woman and not known to be gay, meaning the killer was not just targeting gay men anymore, and that he was targeting just men. And this is what got investigators' attention. Oh, he's not just going after gay men anymore. He's going after married men, husbands, people's sons. Like, oh, it actually might affect us
It
now.
matters now. He's just going after regular guys.
Yeah, so it took that for them to finally be like, maybe we do need to investigate this as a possible serial killer. They also believe that he most likely offered Ronnie a lift after noticing his flat tire, or maybe, terrifyingly, maybe even intentionally flattening it himself. But again, there was little in the way of physical evidence or eyewitnesses pointing to Ronnie's killer, and the case once again went cold. But now at least investigators are aware, thankfully. During this time, Randy was ramping up his killing spree, his relationship with Jeff was falling apart, and the two were growing to despise one another, with them often doing things intentionally trying to make the other one jealous. Their fights often grew more frequent, so did Randy's nights to go cool off, which always coincided with another body being found not long after. Randy would claim his final victim of 1973 on December 29th, when the body of 23-year-old student Vincent Cruz Mestis was found by two hikers at the bottom of a ravine in San Bernardino. He was fully clothed, but like other victims, he was found with a sock inserted into his rectum. His murder was slightly different from the others, as his killer had shaved his hair off and cut off both of his hands. Most disturbing of all, it was discovered that his killer had inserted several toothpicks into his urethra before killing him. Vincent was openly bisexual and had gotten in trouble several times before for hustling at local cruising spots. Several days before his body was found, Vincent had told his roommate that he was heading into the mountains to sketch and was never seen again. Investigators were no closer to solving the case throughout 1974, as Randy would go on to claim at least 5 more victims over the course of this year, most showing signs of increasing torture and violence. On June 2nd, 1974, the body of 20-year-old Michael Eugene Little would be found off the side of Highway 86 in a field propped up against a tree. He was fully nude, with his legs spread widely apart. He had been castrated, and he had been killed by having a tree branch forcefully inserted a foot into his rectum. Malcolm had last been seen alive 2 days before by his brother as he was attempting to hitchhike back home to his girlfriend. Like I said, it's getting increasingly, unspeakably more violent.
And it's happening a lot.
Very, very frequent. And still, I know police are now aware that there's probably a serial killer on their hands. They still seem not as urgent. Later that same month, on June 22nd, the fully nude body of an 18-year-old Marine named Roger Dickerson was found on a golf course near Laguna Beach. Roger was stationed at Camp Pendleton, like Edward Moore, and was last seen the night before his body was found at a nearby sports bar. He was last seen by his friends, stating that he had found someone to drive him to Los Angeles for the weekend, although he never gave them a name. Roger had been killed by ligature strangulation and was sodomized before his death. He had also had his penis and nipples chewed off by the killer. Roger was also found to have a large amount of Valium in his system at the time of his murder, suggesting he had been drugged. On August 3rd, the fully clothed body of 20-year-old Thomas Paxton Lee was found in an oil field. He was once again found with a sock inserted into his rectum, and he had been manually strangled. Thomas was a regular at local gay bars in the area and was often known for his one-night stands. That's their quote, not mine. He was last seen at a gay bar called the Diamond Horseshoe the night before his body was found. Just over a week later, on August 12th, the body of 23-year-old Gary Wayne Cordova was found at the bottom of a 9-foot embankment in Orange County. He had left his home in Pasadena and was planning to hitchhike to Oceanside before he went missing. Now, unlike the other victims, his cause of death was found to be from an overdose of diazepam. Now, the final victim of 1974 was found on November 29th. The body of 19-year-old James Dale Reeves was found in a field off the San Diego freeway. He was fully nude and had been castrated before being killed by having a tree branch lodged up his rectum. Again, on a weekly basis, and this is concerning and stressing me out, thinking about finding these young men and boys in horrific stages of torture and murder, and doesn't seem to be as big of a concern for some people. Now, James was still living at home and had actually borrowed his parents' car a few nights before his body was found in order to attend a community Thanksgiving held at a newly opened church for the gay community. Following the dinner, James had made his way to a popular gay bar called Ripple's, where his parents' car would later be found abandoned. Not long after, on January 3rd, 1975, the body of a 17-year-old high school student named John Laris was found floating in the surf near Laguna Beach. He was fully nude and had been killed by having a wooden stake rammed up his rectum. He was last seen the night before boarding a bus to go to a nearby roller skating rink to try out new skates he had just gotten for Christmas. The thing that stuck out to investigators in this case was the fact that there were tracks left in the sand where it clearly showed where John's body had been dragged to the surf. But that wasn't what was strange. The strange thing was that it clearly showed there were two separate sets of footprints, meaning two people helped dispose of the body. And like I said, we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but this leads us to the long-held belief that Randy Kraft had an accomplice, or even several. Later that same month, on January 17th, the body of 21-year-old Craig Janatis was found dumped in an abandoned parking lot off the Gordon Sales Hotel. He was fully clothed and had been strangled to death with his own shoelaces. So by the end of January, 14 men had been linked to the same killer, and it was clear he was not slowing down anytime soon. Several different police agencies across California got together finally in order to compare notes and evidence as the crimes had been spread across multiple different districts. Desperate for any sort of clues to the identity of the killer, they eventually brought the FBI in to do a profile on the suspected killer. They concluded that the killer was a methodical, organized lust killer who felt indifferent to society and its rules, which goes back, Randy Kraft was said to, he was indifferent, he didn't think the rules applied to him. Investigators also concluded that the main reason for the insertion of the sock, which I'm sure a lot of people are like, was that just a sexual thing for him? Actually, yes, part sexual, but mainly they think the main reason was he put it in there to prevent the bodies from purging waste while they were being held or transported to where they were dumped. And this is actually a common thing that was done in the military, is they'll insert things in your nose and stuff like a body to keep it from expelling any waste or bile. And so they also thought maybe he had military background, but still nothing concrete pointing to an actual suspect. That is, until his next victim, and the final one we'll talk about. He would be found in May. On May 8th, 1975, 3 teenagers playing in the water by Laguna Beach Marina would discover a badly decomposed head floating in the water. A few days later, dental records confirmed the skull belonged to 19-year-old Keith Crotwell, who disappeared without a trace on March 29th. Following this announcement, Keith's friends were quick to go to the police. On the day he went missing, Keith and a friend of his named Kent May were hanging out in the parking lot of the gay bar Ripples when a black and white Ford Mustang pulled up beside them. Friends of the two standing nearby would state that both climbed into the car after talking with the driver, and the three seemed to chat for a minute before suddenly the passenger door opened and Kent was pushed out onto the pavement unconscious. Looking in the car, they saw Keith slump over and appear to pass out against the driver as he sped off into the night. After news of Keith's body being found, his friends knew the driver of the Mustang must be responsible, and this shows you good friends. They staked out Ripples because they're like, this has to be a local. He has to know his way around here, and we know he frequents Ripples, so they staked out Ripples for over 2 weeks until they finally found the car in the parking lot and they got its license plate. Turning it over to police, the license plate led back to one Randy Stephen Kraft. Again, we all need friends like that. So on May 19th, 1975, Randy was officially questioned by detectives in relation to the murder of Keith Crotwell. Of course, he denied having anything to do with it, although he did admit to picking up Keith and Kent the day Keith went missing. He stated that after driving around with the two drinking and smoking weed, he dropped Kent back off at the parking lot and was taking Keith home when his car stalled on a side road. As he walked back to the gas station, he left Keith in the car. By the time he came back, Keith was gone.
Convenient.
Very convenient story here. Randy stated he could corroborate this story as he had phoned his boyfriend Jeff that same evening and told him of the car troubles. And Jeff would later speak to investigators and confirm this. But still, police remained unconvinced. Although they still had no physical evidence that proved Randy murdered Keith, the fact that he may have been the last person to see him alive and just his overall demeanor during the interview, investigators felt confident that he was responsible and they decided to arrest him and charge him with Keith's murder. However, their request for an arrest warrant was denied by the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office as they felt there was not enough sufficient evidence or probable cause for an arrest, and without that, they could do nothing. Investigators were forced to let Randy go. He was once again off the hook and free to continue his killing spree, a killing spree that would go on for another 8 years. We are only in 1975. He wasn't caught until 1983. A killing spree that would go on for 8 years and claim the lives of at least 40 more victims. Something we will talk about next week in part 2 in our coverage of Randy Kraft, aka the scorecard killer. This is a case that I've known about since long before we started the podcast, and it's always been on my list to do. And I think now's a good time to cover it because this is one of those cases I wanted to be very thorough with and just try to get as much details as possible in the episode. So that's why I'm like, this is way too much for one episode. It's going to be a 2-parter. And so we will see you guys back next week. And until then, I'm going to give you time to digest this because I know it was a rough case. But again, necessary to remind everyone, this is real life. There was really a man out there this sadistic. And with that, thank you guys so much again for tuning in for another episode. If you enjoy the podcast and this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot. Helps other people discover the podcast. And of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at beerswithqueerspod, that's POD, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until Monday, stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.